I had just moved into a new apartment complex and was excited to start my new life. Everything seemed perfect, except for my neighbour, Mr. Wilson, or as he preferred to be called, Jeffy. Every time I stepped into the lift, he was there, with a big smile on his face. He would always greet me with a friendly, "Good morning," or "How are you today?" At first, I was happy to have a friendly neighbour. I would chat with him on our short elevator rides and we would laugh at silly jokes. But as the days went on, he seemed to be in the lift almost every single time that I was, and it started to feel strange. He would always ask me personal questions about my life too, and it made me feel uncomfortable. So eventually I started to avoid him any way I could. But it was almost impossible. He would always be there, waiting for me. One day I mustered up the courage to confront him about this. "Why are you always in the lift when I am?" I asked with a jokey tone, trying not to make the conversation too uncomfortable. But he just smiled and said that it was a pleasant coincidence, and he was unsure why, but grateful to spend time with me nonetheless. This response made me feel extremely uneasy, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, as I'm usually not one to judge. But the next day I stepped into the lift, and of course he was there again. This time we laughed about how we kept running into each other, but as the days went on, he became more and more aggressive. He would sometimes touch my arm or shoulder while we were talking, and it made me feel even more uncomfortable. But then, everything suddenly became clear one night, when I heard a strange buzzing noise coming from my bedroom. I investigated, and after a long search, I found a small camera in one of my electric sockets. It was then that I realised that Mr. Wilson had been watching me the whole time. I felt so violated and scared. I reported him to the building management and the police, but other than removing the device and investigating the footage, there was nothing they could do to prove that it was in fact my neighbour. I pleaded with them, saying that someone must be breaking in, so they advised me to change the locks, which I did. After that day, I never bumped into Mr. Wilson again. Maybe he tried to break in one night and found that the locks had changed. Or maybe the camera was just left from the previous tenant, and nobody had been monitoring the footage. But either way, I never felt comfortable in that apartment again. And as soon as my contract expired, I moved to the other side of town to be as far away as possible, but still within commuting distance for my job. To this day, I have never been as petrified as I was the day I found that camera. I remember I was on a school trip to France and we had to take a ferry to get there. I was excited as this was my first time on a ferry and my friends and I were all chatting and taking pictures, just enjoying the ride. However, something strange caught my attention. There were a group of foreign men on the ferry and they were taking pictures of some of the girls on our school trip. At first it seemed harmless, as the girls were tolerating it and even posing for the camera. One of the men even put his arm around one of my female friends and posed with her. But as the ferry ride continued, things started to get even weirder. The men were taking more and more pictures and they seemed to be getting closer to the girls. They started following them around the ferry and it was clear that the girls were starting to feel uncomfortable. Then suddenly we noticed that one of the girls had gone missing. We searched the entire ferry, but we couldn't find her anywhere. We were all worried sick, and the teachers were frantically calling her name over the intercom. Finally, we found her in an empty room, crying in the corner. She refused to talk and kept shaking her head when we asked her what happened. We didn't know what to do, and eventually there was nothing anybody could do, as she wasn't being honest about the situation. The ferry eventually docked in France, and we went on our school trip. But the incident on that ferry had haunted me for months afterwards. I knew something terrible had happened, and I knew the men taking pictures of the girls had something to do with it. It wasn't until a few months later that she finally opened up to me about what had really happened. She told me that one of the men had grabbed her and tried to force her into a room on the ferry. He apparently touched her inappropriately and tried to kiss her, but she had managed to break free and run away and hide. She was too scared to tell anyone at the time, as she was ashamed. I was furious when I heard this, and I demanded that she tell the police. But she was still too embarrassed and didn't want to make a big deal out of it, as it was her fault for tolerating them in the first place. Well, it took a lot of convincing, but eventually I was able to get her to come clean to the police about what had really happened on the ferry that day. The man was eventually caught and brought to justice, but my friend has never been the same since. She used to be so happy and would constantly be doing silly things to make us laugh, but now she's very reserved, and over time we've started seeing less and less of her. To be honest, I haven't spoken to her now for over a year, I think, but I truly hope that she is okay, and that she's been able to overcome that horrible experience. I had been a TikToker for a few months at this point, and I'd seen some really fast growth from my trending videos. I was always on the lookout for new and exciting video ideas, and eventually I stumbled upon this trend where I would walk through a store with my phone in my back pocket, recording people who looked at my backside. At first, it was just harmless fun. I would put my phone in my back pocket and film the reactions of men as I walked past them. It was all good until one of my fans commented that they noticed the same man in all of the different stores where I recorded. He was always in the background, never looking away from me. His eyes were intense, and he would follow me around the store, always at a safe distance. Well, my videos had really blown up, and the views I was getting made me completely disregard the possible dangers. In fact, the controversy actually gave my videos more attention, which in turn grew my following even more. I continued with my videos, but I started going to different stores in the hopes he wouldn't be there. But as the days went by, his presence became impossible to ignore. It was as if he was watching my every move, and I began to feel uneasy and nervous, always checking my surroundings to see if he was there. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being watched every minute of the day. I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was around me, waiting for the right moment. Well, a few more days went by, and I didn't see him again. I assumed that maybe he had seen the TikTok videos and had given up, but then I received a video from one of my fans. It was a warning that the man who had been stalking me was outside my house. They had linked a TikTok account that had several videos of me. The account only had about 20 followers, and they all looked like bots, but for every video thumbnail I saw on the account, I recognized the location. My heart raced as I saw the most recent upload, which was a short 5-second video of my house, followed by a sinister laugh at the end just before the video cut out. I peeked through the window and saw a figure standing in the shadows. I knew it was him. I could feel my breaths getting shorter and my heart pounding even harder. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. Luckily, he hadn't tried anything and was still just waiting for his moment, I guess, because the police managed to find the man, hiding behind some bushes in my backyard, watching me through the window. I was terrified when I found out. He had clearly been getting closer to breaking in. The police arrested him, and I later found out that he had been stalking me for weeks. He had been following me everywhere, not just the stores. I deleted my account after this experience. I was too petrified to continue creating the same content, and I was fearful that someone else might take his place. I mean, let's be honest, you never really know who's watching you on the internet. We had just moved to a new town and found a lovely home to rent. It was perfect for our family, spacious, cosy, and in a quiet neighbourhood. But from the very first day, I had this sense that we were being watched. The old man next door would always be standing at his window, staring at us as we pulled up into the driveway. It was so unnerving. We would catch him watching us every time we left the house or came back home. It didn't even matter what time of day it was. He would always be there, peering out of his window. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just curious about his new neighbours. But as the days went by, it became clear that he was watching our every move. Whenever we were outside, he would stand by his window and glare. It was creepy and made me feel so uncomfortable. I decided to talk to him and ask if everything was okay, but he just stared blankly at me and closed his door without saying a word. It was as if he didn't want to be bothered, and that he found pleasure in silently watching us. Even my kids began to feel scared and wouldn't want to play outside, knowing he was always there. We started to feel like prisoners in our own home, never able to relax or be comfortable. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I looked outside and there he was again, standing in the dark. Eventually we decided that we needed to move. We were all just so uncomfortable, and of course there was nothing we can do, as all he was doing was watching us. And as far as I'm aware, that's not a criminal offence. We couldn't just continue living our lives constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering if he was there. It was such an unsettling feeling, and one that we couldn't shake. We moved out the following week, and I never saw him again. I don't know if he was truly dangerous or just an old man with too much time on his hands, but I'm just so glad that we no longer live in that house. I stepped onto the bus, grateful for the chance to finally sit down and rest after a long day at work. As I squeezed past the other passengers, I noticed a man standing in the aisle, looking directly at me. His eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long, making me feel slightly uncomfortable. I quickly took a seat and pulled out my phone, pretending to be engrossed in something, hoping to avoid any interaction with this stranger that was still staring in my direction. But despite my attempts to ignore him, I could feel him getting closer and closer to me. At first, I thought he was just moving to make room for other passengers. But as more people got off the bus and the crowd started to thin out, the man still stood just inches away from me. I tried to shift away, but there was nowhere else to go. Then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. I noticed that the man had his phone out and he was pointing it at my skirt. The camera lens was directed right at me, and I realized that he was taking pictures without my consent. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. I felt exposed and violated, and I wanted to yell and scream at him about his disgusting behaviour. But I was too afraid. I quickly got off the bus at the next stop and ran as fast as I could, tears streaming down my face. I knew I had to report what had happened, but for some reason I felt silly telling the police, as I had absolutely no evidence, and how were they ever going to find him? For days afterwards, I was filled with a sense of dread and paranoia every time I stepped out of my house. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that the man might be following me. I eventually decided that I had to take action. I went to the police and filed a report, but they told me there wasn't much that they could do unless I had caught the man in the act. I was left feeling hopeless and vulnerable, like there was no justice for me. But then, things took a turn for the worse, as a few days later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a note, along with a series of explicit photos of me that had been taken without my knowledge. The note was filled with lewd comments and threats, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. I decided to take matters into my own hands, and I installed security cameras in my home, and carried pepper spray with me wherever I went. But the fear and anxiety never fully went away. I did show the police the package, but it was untraceable, even after they ran forensic tests to try and find any DNA. From that day on, every time I hear footsteps behind me, or see a stranger on the bus that looks remotely similar to that man, I feel a wave of panic wash over me. Luckily, I am yet to see him again, but I'm not so sure if he can say the same. I had been stuck in my house for days due to an intense snowstorm that had made it impossible for my family to come home. At first, I enjoyed the peace and quiet, snuggled up in blankets with hot cocoa and a good book. But as the nights wore on, a growing sense of unease settled into the pit of my stomach. It started with the small things, like the creaking of the old wooden floorboards and the flickering of the lights. But soon, I began to hear strange noises in the middle of the night, scratching and tapping on the windows, as if someone, or something, was trying to get inside. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or an overactive imagination. But the fear wouldn't go away, and then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, heart pounding in my chest as the growl grew louder and closer. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel a presence looming over me, watching me with malevolent intent. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat as a cold, bony hand wrapped around my ankle, dragging me out of bed and towards the open window. I fought and kicked, but the grip on my ankle only tightened, pulling me closer and closer to the edge. But just when I thought it was all over, a bright light flooded the room, revealing my parents standing in the doorway, with concerned looks on their faces. The hand released its grip, and I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My parents explained that they had finally been able to make it home and had seen strange footprints leading up to the house. They had found the window open and had rushed inside to make sure I was okay. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't come home when they did, but I never want to be alone in that house again. Something evil had been lurking in the shadows, and I just knew it was waiting for another chance to strike. It was a typical Monday evening in London. I had just finished work and was on my way home, taking the Underground as usual. The train was crowded, but I managed to find a seat next to the window. I settled in and took out my phone to check my messages, trying to ignore the noise around me, when suddenly a man sat down next to me. He was tall and had a scruffy beard. He looked at me and smiled, and I could feel my skin crawl. He started talking to me, asking me about my day, but I didn't want to engage in conversation. I gave him short answers and looked out the window, hoping he would get the hint. But he didn't. He kept talking to me, telling me about his life, and I could feel him getting closer and closer to me. I tried to move away, but the train was too crowded. Finally, my stop arrived, and I got up quickly, trying to push past him. But he grabbed my arm and pulled me back, his grip tight and painful. "Don't go yet," he said. "Let's talk some more." I was terrified. I struggled to get free, but he wouldn't let me go. And then, suddenly, the train's lights went out. The entire carriage was plunged into darkness, and I could hear screams and cries of panic from other passengers. But the man next to me didn't seem to be affected. He kept holding me, his grip getting tighter, and then, in the darkness, I felt something sharp against my neck. I screamed and struggled, but he just wouldn't let go. But then, just when I thought it was all over, the lights flickered back on, and the train was brought to a halt. The man let me go, and I stumbled out of the carriage, gasping for air. As I walked home, shaken and scared, I couldn't get rid of that feeling that he was still following me. I looked around every corner, trying to see if he was there, but I couldn't find him. It wasn't until I got home that I finally realised what had happened. This man had put a knife to my throat on that train, but I'd somehow managed to escape his clutches. I felt lucky, but even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. and every time I take the underground, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting for his next victim. When the new couple moved in down the street, I couldn't help but notice how strange they were. They never waved back when I said hello, and they always seemed to be up late at night. There was a strange energy emanating from their house that made everybody down the street feel uneasy. At first, I thought maybe they were just night owls, or perhaps they worked really odd hours. But then I noticed something else that made me even more suspicious. Every night around 3 a.m, they would come out of their house and dump their trash into the bins outside. It was an odd time to be taking out the garbage, and I couldn't help but wonder what they were doing up so late. The more I observed them, the more I realized how little I actually knew about them. They never had any visitors, and they never left the house during the day. And yet there was always a light on somewhere inside, no matter what time of day or night it was. One day I decided to confront them. I went over to their house and rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I could hear movement inside, but they didn't come to the door. It was as if they were purposely avoiding me. That's when I started to get really worried. What kind of people were they, and what were they doing in that house? The more I thought about it, the more my mind started to race with possibilities. I decided to stay up late and watch their house. I wanted to see if I could catch a glimpse of what they were up to. As I watched from across the street, I noticed something strange. Their windows were all covered with blackout curtains, so I couldn't see inside. But I could hear weird noises coming from their house, scratching and thumping, and other unidentifiable sounds. I stayed up for hours, waiting to see if anything would happen. But nothing did. Finally, around 2 a.m, I decided to give up and go to bed. But as I climbed into bed, I suddenly heard a strange sound coming from outside, like something scratching at my window. I bolted upright in bed and looked outside, but I didn't see anything. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, but it was no use. The strange behaviour of my neighbours had clearly gotten under my skin. In the end, they only lived here for less than a year before they eventually moved away. I never found out what they were doing, but I spoke to the other neighbours and nobody is really sure. Some say they were involved in human trafficking or drug dealing, but it could just be that they were an odd couple that liked their privacy, but who knows what they were really up to. Either way, I certainly feel a lot safer now, knowing they're no longer living in my neighbourhood. I think I was about 13 at the time. I was home alone, sitting on the couch in my living room, scrolling through my phone just waiting for my parents to come home. It was already late and I was starting to get a bit bored, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper that seemed to be coming from the attic. I froze, unsure of what to do. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the whisper persisted. It sounded like a woman's voice, asking for something. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone of her voice was urgent. I cautiously made my way to the bottom of the attic stairs and looked up. The door was closed, but I could hear the whispering much more clearly now. I hesitated for a moment before slowly climbing the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. As I reached the top of the stairs, the whispering stopped. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw her. The woman in the attic. She was sitting on an old wooden chest, her crazy hair and eyes looking as if they were rolling to the back of her head. She was wearing a dirty pair of jeans and a loose rag for a shirt. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible when inside I was screaming. She looked up at me, and her eyes locked onto mine. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need some supplies. I've been up here for days, and I'm running out of food and water." I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to give her anything, but at the same time, I didn't want to leave her up there to starve. I felt bad for her. I told her I would be right back and went down to the kitchen. I was caught in two minds. Did I call the police? Did I call my parents? Or did I go and get her some supplies to help her? While I was trying to make up my mind, I heard a loud thump coming from the attic. I raced back upstairs, and when I opened the door, the woman was now standing right in front of me, her eyes now even wider and her hair standing on end. I backed away and she took a step forward. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding almost normal at this point. "You've been very kind." And then, without warning, she lunged at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose board on the floor. As I fell, I heard her laugh, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that chilled me to the bone. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house, screaming for help. Eventually, one of my neighbours phoned the police, and when they arrived, they found that woman still in my house, and still in the attic. She had been living there for weeks, surviving on scraps of food and water that she had managed to scavenge. The woman was taken away, and my parents came home to find me shaken, but luckily unharmed. A few weeks later, we moved out of that house, but I never forgot about the woman in the attic. To this day, I can still hear her whispers in my dreams. As I left the swimming pool, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The class had been tough, and I was looking forward to going home and getting some much-needed rest. But as I started walking down the street, I noticed a man on the other side of the road. He was walking maybe a few steps behind me, keeping his distance, but I could feel his eyes were on me. I turned around and realised that he'd crossed the road, and he quickly looked away, pretending to be interested on his phone. I tried to ignore him and kept walking, but I could feel his presence behind me. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose him, but he matched my steps. I knew I was in trouble, so I looked around, hoping to see someone I knew, or maybe a police officer, but the street was deserted. The man started to walk faster, and I knew he was getting closer, and I could hear him muttering to himself. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, and I stumbled. He caught up with me, and I felt his hand on my shoulder. I turned around again, and this was when I saw his face for the first time. His eyes were dark, and his face was twisted in a sinister grin. He whispered in my ear, telling me that he had been watching me, and then pushed me against the wall and started to grope me. I felt sick to my stomach, and tears were streaming down my face. But then, I remembered the self-defense move that my dad had taught me. I kicked this man hard in the groin, and he stumbled back in pain. I took advantage of this moment, and ran as fast as I could. I could hear him chasing me, but there was no chance I was looking back. I just ran until I reached a busy street, and I saw a police car parked nearby. I ran towards it, screaming for help. The man was eventually caught, but I will forever be aware of just how lucky I was to have escaped that day. I was home alone for the first time in ages, and while I was quite excited at first, as night fell, a creeping sense of unease began to take over. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional creak or groan, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. I decided to watch some TV to take my mind off things, but as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The shadows around me seemed to shift and move, and every time I looked up, I swore I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore it and focus on the TV, but then I heard a shuffling sound coming from the back of the house. It was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder and more distinct. My heart began to race as I realized that someone was in my house. I reached for my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly that I accidentally dropped it. I was about to get up and run for the back door when I realized, to my horror, that I had left it unlocked. I could feel the cold sweat starting to form on my forehead as I tiptoed towards the door, my hand reaching for the lock. But just as I was about to turn it, I heard a loud crash coming from the living room. I froze, not knowing what to do next. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure dart across the room. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see that it was holding something in its hand. I knew that I had to get out of there, so I grabbed a torch from the kitchen and ran towards the back door. But as I reached for the handle, I saw my own reflection in the mirror on the wall. I stopped dead in my tracks as I realized that the figure I had seen in the living room was me, reflected in the glass. I had been so terrified that I had imagined everything, and the shuffling sound had been nothing more than just the house settling as it always did. I felt foolish but relieved at the same time. I knew that I couldn't let my fear control me, so I took a deep breath, locked the back door and went back to the living room to watch TV, with the torch in my hand just in case. But that feeling of unease didn't leave me until weeks later. Maybe everything I saw was just my reflection, but there's still a small part of me that isn't so sure. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.